So good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Davis. And on behalf of the Hoover Institution and our director, Condoleezza Rice, let me welcome you to this conference on the future of the geoeconomic environment. We're delighted to have your participation, and we look forward with keen anticipation to the presentations and discussions. We live in an extraordinary moment. New technologies offer tremendous potential to improve our lives and to disrupt our societies. International economic and security relationships that have endured for decades are under enormous strain. Whether they survive and in what form is unclear. In short, the geoeconomic environment is highly fluid. 3 examples. Early last month, U.S. military forces entered Venezuela, captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and brought them to the United States to face criminal charges. What will become of Venezuela and what that portends for U.S. engagement in Latin America remains to be determined. Second example, just this morning, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Trump administration tariffs imposed under the International Economic Powers Act of 1977, IEPA. Those tariffs accounted for about 70% of the tariff revenues that the United States has collected under the Trump administration's new tariffs imposed in 2025. So in other words, the Supreme Court has just stripped the Trump administration of the most important statutory underpinning of a central element of its foreign policy and economic policy. And here I want to tip my hat to 2 colleagues at the Hoover Institution who played major roles in building the legal case against the IEPA tariffs. So that's our senior fellows, Michael McConnell and Philip Zelikow. Michael or Philip?
They're both coming soon.
They're both coming, okay. So they missed the hat tip. But it's an example of the important role that the Hoover Institution plays in these consequential policy developments. A third example. The U.S. forces appear poised for major military strikes on the Iranian regime. I don't know whether that will happen, but if it happens, it will have profound geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences. So we need insights grounded in research and real-world experience to help us understand the geoeconomic environment and to shape it in ways that will build a better, more secure, prosperous world. And my aspiration for today's conference is that we will take some steps towards those goals today through the presentations and discussions across disciplines, across very different domains of experience, across different geographies, and more. So we have a lot to learn from each other. Now, before we get started with the first presentation, a few housekeeping matters. First, we will be recorded today. Okay, and it's likely that we will post some or all of these proceedings on the web. They're not going to get like a big rollout, but they're going to be available for those who are not privileged and fortunate enough to be here in person. Second, bathrooms, important matter. So if you go out of this building, and I have to orient myself, over there is the Schultz building. There are bathrooms on the first floor, the ground floor of that building as you enter. The other direction is HHMB. You have to go up or down from the ground floor to reach a bathroom, okay? But you have either of those options. And then last, we would like to take a photo, I'd like to have a photo session at 5:30, so if you could stick around for that, that would be great. And with that, we'll get started with our first step towards addressing these geoeconomic challenges that we face today. And that will be a presentation and discussion to follow. Presentation by Matteo Maggiori. He's a senior fellow by courtesy at the Hoover Institution and a professor at Stanford GSB. Matteo will have 30 minutes, up to 30 minutes for his presentation, which is titled, appropriately enough, Geoeconomics. Matteo, take it away.
Fantastic. Well,
First of all, thank you all for being here. I guess I've been tasked with kicking this one off, so I'll try to give an overview of at least my thinking on geoeconomics and touch on some of the topics that the rest of the presentations and the panels are going to probably go deeper on. I actually welcome questions during, so please, if you have qualifying questions, just step in, and then if you have bigger thoughts on how this is all wrong, you might want to wait for that one until the end. I used to have to motivate what geoeconomics is. Now I'm motivated a lot less. It's an activity that shapes the world. As of this morning, there's a new piece of news that I could add here. I stopped updating this because there's just too high frequency for me. But every day there is something. So when we started thinking about this topic 4 years ago, I thought it was going to be my most counter-cyclical research agenda. And I thought that people were going to make fun of the word geoeconomics. By now, it's super pro-cyclical. I wake up in the morning, and there's no bad assumptions I've made that somehow haven't been validated by something in the data. So it's kind of fun. But what I actually think geoeconomics is, people have different, slightly different views. I think of it as hegemonic countries like the US and China that use the existing trade and finance relationship in their economies to achieve either political goals or economic goals. And so the moment you think of it this way, there is so many good questions. First, is this power effective? In which dimensions? Is this even a thing? If you have it, how should you wield it? And then, of course, we care about welfare. The typical colloquial mercantilist version is this is fixed resources on the table, and we're bargaining over who gets them. But as an economist, you immediately want to dispel that notion. You want to think that this might be an activity that is positive sum or might be negative sum. But certainly the case of zero sum, it's a measured zero case in some sense. You then want to think about which sectors are strategic. This is a word that gets abused a lot because if you want to lobby for anything, just call it strategic in the national interest. Part of the ability to lobby comes from the fact that there is no precise quantifiable definitions or ways to do counterfactuals. So what I'm not going to go through all the questions, but what we wanted to get into is a way to have clean theory that lets people disagree on something that we both at least understand what we mean, and also theory that it's hopefully something that you can bring to the data and quantify and do policy counterfactuals. So that's what we started. This also reminds me that everything I'm going to say today, it's really credit to my co-author Chris and Jesse, who are doing most of the work. I just get to talk about it. Now, Jim Fearon is here at the table, and I would be totally wrong if I didn't state that economists are late to this game. We were early, then we dropped it, and then we're coming back to it. While the political science field has really kept a lot of these ideas alive. So my typical complaint in economics is that we've reduced power to mean market power, the ability to sell at a markup for firms. But generally, when we say that a country is powerful or JP Morgan and Google are powerful, we mean something much broader than that. And in political science, there are plenty of definitions of power. One that I'm going to use goes back to 57. Brent has power over me to the extent that he can get me to do something that otherwise I wouldn't want to do. It's a very simple definition of power that it's almost like relational. We take as given the world and just Brent is getting me to do something. There is another notion of power that I'm going to also use called structural power that comes from the work of Susan Strange, where Brent as a hegemon is instead thinking about shaping the entire room, shaping the entire equilibrium in ways that might be in his favor, like the rules of the game. I'm going to give it an economic interpretation later. Now, it's also fair that these notions are informal and hard to take to the data. And so what I'm going to try to do is make them very, very formal in a way that hopefully you can take to the data for measurement. Now, I said that economists were early and now we're late. So if you've never read it, I strongly suggest reading a book from Hirschman in 45 called National Power and the Structure of Foreign Trade. He was a young economist here at Berkeley in Maurice's department, and he had just escaped Nazi-occupied France and Germany. And he came in thinking about how Germany had used its economic might in the build-up to the war to exert power. And I like the book a lot. First, because he has a clear distaste for just thinking of it as mercantilism, but he also articulates a pretty useful view that in the debate of plenty versus power, you can't think that laissez-faire is always going to maximize plenty, and we're never going to think about power issues. And so I think it's a useful view. Also, to make clear my complaint, every economic student meets the Hirschman-Herfindahl index. That index is now heavily used to measure concentration in market power for firms. And no student knows that that index was originally developed to study concentrations in foreign trade and dependency on other countries. So you can see a little bit the tendency of reducing everything to markup by firms and losing a lot of the interesting connotation. Also, just in case you're an economist and you're saying, well, it's not really true, we did great work all along. I like to make things quantitative. I pulled all the citation of this book. I classified them in various fields. You can see economics in red. We were the vast majority of the citations for this book in the 70s. We went the way of the dodo. Political science, that is in blue, really accounts for the vast majority of the study of this topic. And if I'm doing my job right, eventually that red line will start to creep back up as people rediscover these topics. Now, that's broad background. I'm going to do one more broad slide, and then unfortunately for those of you that don't like economic theory, I'm going to go to actual equations. But first, I want to show you how you can translate some of these topics, or at least how I think about them, in a formal setup. And I'll try to make it concrete. Suppose that we start with ASML. This is a Dutch lithography firm, produces advanced machines for etching semiconductors. He has US suppliers and he has Chinese customers, or at least he used to, like SMIC. Undisturbed is making optimal decisions given an environment, a set of variables Z that might be the world prices, aggregate demand, the usual thing. Okay, now the US government comes in and he would like to get ASML to do something that ASML doesn't want to do. The ask is stop selling these machines to China. Now, this is a foreign firm, so the typical recourse that the US government has to domestic legislation like export controls is off the table. You have to induce them. So one thing that you can do is you can threaten them. That's a negative inducement. Allegedly, in this particular case, the threat was to impose a foreign direct product rule. It's a little known provision of the Cold War until recently that says that if you don't do what I say and you're using some part of US technology, I might add you to something like an entity list, okay? Now for ASML, that's a serious threat. That's a death sentence. So now you're thinking, okay, the value function of that firm has now moved all the way to the left. If that threat is realized, the firm is worth a lot less. So now you can immediately see as an economist that a useful construct is thinking of these bargains as a participation constraint. The power that Brent or the US hegemon has over ASML is the gap between the inside option and the outside option. And everything is going to fit into that. Positive inducements bring the outside option up. I might tell you, if you do what I say, I give you foreign aid. Negative inducements bring the outside option down. And the gap between the two is the maximum private cost of the actions that you can ask before the person says, I'm going to walk away. I'm just not going to do it for you, okay? So that's going to be a useful notion of power, and I will show you that you can take it to the data. Now, that notion corresponds to micropower. ASML takes the world as given and is checking its private cost of doing what the US wants to do. But of course, the US is bargaining not just with ASML, but with the lens producers, with the etching firms, with an entire economic environment. And what the US is doing in asking each one of them to do something is thinking of manipulating the aggregate state variables, the entire environment, including technology, prices, in its favor. So you can see that this gives a formal economic definition of something that looks like structural power. You're just taking derivatives over state variables. You're twisting the equilibrium in your favor, and it's particularly helpful because the targets consider their private cost, but you're maximizing your social surplus. So if you think about the rationale for policy in this space, it's much stronger than the typical rationale for, say, regulating banks. With financial externalities, we think the banks are all doing their own business and they don't understand that they're doing the same thing. Here is very different. You have a large adversarial player who's skewing the equilibrium against you. So the probability that you don't want to do a policy intervention is much lower. The case is much stronger intellectually. Okay, now I gave you this general. Now if you're an economist, you want to see the goods. So let me show you the equations, okay? And I'll try to do them gently. So there are n countries around the world. There's a set of productive sectors and local factors. So think of an activity as something that is occurring in one country. So Russian oil and American oil are two different sectors. Their output might be perfect substitutes in production, but they're in two different locations. Each sector has a unit mass of firms. They're producing with a typical technology that uses local factors like labor and some intermediate inputs. But also that Z is in the vector. If you're an economist, that's a familiar trick to keep track of externalities. Things like economies of scale, strategic complementarities will show up there. The typical example is the payment system, which I will use. Using the payment system, for me, it's more productive if everybody else is using it. So that's a strategic complementarity, okay? I'm gonna capture that one. The governments are pretty simple. They're maximizing the consumer utility. Consumer utility, it's straightforward. It's a consumption plan, and how do I finance it? I have profits on my firms and income on my factors, okay? So it's as standard as it gets, and I'm gonna skip some of the rest of the details. The policy game is the important part. I'm gonna do offense and defense so that you can see those concepts in action. So at the end, production and consumption will take place just as we described it. In the middle, I'm gonna formalize what an hegemon is in this environment. So this is the offense. If you're the US, you're gonna approach entities all around the world, and you're gonna offer exactly the deal that I informally described with ASML. You're gonna tell me what you want me to do, which might be a very specific action. Don't sell this input to this company. And you're gonna tell me what the consequences are for me not complying. What are the threats? And the threats I'm gonna use today are, you're just not gonna sell me things I need. So think of them as export controls. You don't do what I say, you lose access to inputs I control. The rest of the world accepts or rejects, but ex ante they play defense, and that's gonna be important. This is something that we're seeing massively around the world right now. Every country is thinking, I'm gonna be approached later and be bullied by the US or China to do something. How do I want to shape my own economy ahead of time, knowing that this is gonna happen to me? So things like domestic industrial policy, tariffs are all instruments to reshape your economy to potentially reduce dependency so that you can withstand the ex-post pressure. Okay, they're gonna try to minimize those gaps. So to make it concrete, I'm gonna study a super simple example. I'm gonna think of the US as a single sector, the payment system. It sells it all around the world. And it's like Facebook or X or whatever it is. It's got a strategic complementarity. You want to be on it if everybody else is on it, okay? Every economy around the world is super simple. It can produce the same thing domestically as an alternative domestic payment system. If you're Russia, you have SPF. You have an intermediary that can decides how much of the global system and how much of the local to use. End of the story. Okay? But there are two externalities. There's a strategic one that I told you, a strategic complementarity across countries. And then each domestic alternative is more efficient if you scale it up ahead of time. Okay? So if you have to start from scratch a payment system ex post, that's very difficult. If you already have scaled it up, it's relatively productive. Okay? That's all. So I'm going to guide you through the logic of what happens in the equilibrium. I'm not going to describe how we get there. But I want to start with the two cases that in global macro trade we would have studied before. The obvious case is the global planner. There's some benevolent planner out there that tries to make the world the best he can for everybody. What is he going to do? It's going to subsidize both technologies. It's going to make sure that both technologies are adopted more than the private sector would like because they have positive externalities. So that's the standard argument for the gains from trade. This is an economy with external economies of scale and strategic complementarities, and trade is good for everybody, and the planner wants to kick it up a notch to make them internalize this. The other thing that we typically study is what happens if each country makes decisions independently, but there is no hegemon. In that world, it's simple what happens. Every country sees its own externalities, so the domestic system gets scaled efficiently. That's the standard result in economics of anything domestically you can take care of with your own policy. Anything across border goes to waste because there is nobody coordinating, and so nobody either subsidizes or taxes the global technology. They just ignore it because each country feels, I'm too small to affect the equilibrium. Now let's see what happens when you have the US or China in the middle being a coercive hegemon. So first, I'm going to try to make formal the things that I said at the beginning. So how to think about power in this context? So the firm is there. It has a marginal revenue curve and a cost curve. So what we teach undergraduates is that the value of the firm is the area between those two curves. What the hegemon wants is it wants you to have no alternative. Its power comes from when I cut you off, how well can you do without me? Now that means that if I cut you off from my payment system, when we disconnect Russia from SWIFT, the marginal cost curve of Russia goes up. It's just a lot more difficult to sustain the economy activity without that payment system. The value that I can extract out of you is the difference between these two things. The inside option of complying and keep doing business with me, and the outside option of what happens if you invade Ukraine and I cut you off. Okay? That's my power. Russia cares about the opposite. The country that is being targeted cares about what they're left with. Now, fundamentally, that's the problem. You can see why hegemons here can be bad or can be good. Why? Because the hegemon cares about a gap, the inside versus the outside. The rest of the countries care about a level, what they're left with. So think about this. Here, the hegemon is like a drug dealer. If I can get you to have an addiction to the things I sell, that makes the outside option really, really bad. And for me, that's okay, even if it destroys value at the inside option, as long as I'm maximizing that gap. So I'm perfectly happy to over-globalize. You will see that in a second, here the US wants to generate hyper-globalization. It wants to integrate the world economy much more than the planet would like, because it generates a lot of dependency on itself. Okay, and then we'll think about what happens on the rest. So here's formally what it does. The US goes around, very much like the tweets we've seen, and says, first, I'm gonna tell you that you have to use my own technology. Second, I'm gonna tell you that you must not build an alternative. I'm trying to discourage you building an alternative because I want to have dependency. Those are my asks. And you can see that here I'm playing everybody against each other. Each person complies with this ask, taking as given the world, and not understanding that every other country is being told not to build an alternative, and that collectively we're generating a ton of dependency. You can see analogy, for example, with some of the policies from China in Africa. Every country is taking, well, I'm getting this deal, it seems like a good deal, and they're not looking at their neighbor and what's happening to them, and overall how that's gonna make the entire equilibrium look in infrastructure, say. This is the typical thing that will happen. And I promise you, we're almost done with the questions. We're gonna go to the data. Now, think about what anti-coercion policy is. Right now, every country is putting forward some policies on economic security, unclear what the rationale is or what's the inefficiency. This gives you at least one answer, which is what you're trying to do ex ante is you're trying to make sure that your outside option is not so bad. You're gonna shape your economy, understanding what's gonna happen to you when you get approached, trying to insulate yourself. So you're trying to push that marginal cost curve up as much as you can. In this particular example I gave you, what do? It's extreme, and you will see why I cooked it up this way. In this example, you actually ban your own firms from ever using the hegemon system. You tell them you only use the domestic payment system, never ever use the US system. Now that's extreme, and I rigged it up for a reason that you will see in a second. In general, what you're going to do is try to move away, give up some of the gains from trade in order to generate more security. It's gonna be an interior solution. Why did I do it this way? Because it brings to a few lessons, and then we're gonna go to the data. So first, unfortunately, in these kind of models, there is a deep trade-off between economic security and the gains from trade. Because precisely those mechanisms that generate the gains from trade in a lot of our models, economies of scale, strategic complementarity, specializations, also generate dependency. Why? Because the moment I didn't scale that technology, implicitly, I've generated a poor alternative. In a standard model where you don't hold me up, that's perfectly fine. You specialize in something else and we trade with each other. But what if you can bully me and I never scaled up my alternative? All of a sudden, that exact same mechanism that generates the gains from trade also generates a dependency. And that tells you that you have to now reassess that trade-off. If you thought that they were never gonna come for you, the dependency wouldn't have been a problem. You would have simply maximized the gains from trade. If you think that they're gonna come from you, you might wanna walk it backwards somewhat and figure out the new optimal point. So it's, I call it like a Krugman meets geoeconomics for that reason, because a lot of the typical argument from new trade theory have to do precisely with the specialization coming, the gains coming from specialization. There's two bad messages, I guess, or two bad news. The first one is, if you actually do economic security uncoordinated, we end up in a pretty bad place. We end up overly secure and destroy too much of the gains from trade. Why? Because Darrell starts to pull out because he feels like he's gonna get bullied. But then Brent starts thinking, well, if Darrell pulls out, the system is not so valuable for me because he's not there anymore. He starts to pull out and we keep going and we end up in a world where we all feel very secure, but we gave up too much. And that's where, for example, coordination with allies and multilateral institutions help. The last point is something that I've massively changed my mind on recently. As an economist, I always thought of international organizations as an incarnation of a planner. If you told me model a multilateral organizations, I would have started with the planner. Instead, I now really think of them as an incarnation of a hegemon. Think about what just happened in this model. The hegemon has all the power, and in equilibrium, he ends up with no power because everybody's so scared of being bullied ex post that they walk away. Here, if the hegemon agreed to limit his coercion ex post, even unilaterally, it would have been better. It would have actually lured people into his network and maintained some power. And so you can think of a world where a lot of the institutions that we set up are an incarnation of an hegemon that wants to make sure that everybody else is not so scared that in equilibrium they walk away. And perhaps some of what we've seen in the last few years has been a decrease in that commitment and a return to very coercive policy. And we have to worry that in the short run you can do it because they are in your network. They trust that you were not going to do it. But what if they update that this is now what you're going to do all the time and they start to move away? You might deplete in the long run a lot of the capital. And I think that this is a view that, for example, is very prominent in political science and not at all in economics. And I changed my mind quite substantially on this. I never thought about it this way. Okay, now the last few minutes, I'll do two things. First, I'll do something that most economists in the room know. I promised that part of the reason to do theory in these topics is to make notions of power formal so that we can disagree on things that we understand, that have equations, but also so that you can bring them to the data and start thinking about counterfactual. How much power do you really have? If I cut you off, is this threat important or not? When we threaten a country with not having access to semiconductors, what can we really get in return? Can we get in return can we make major asks? Or these are things that really don't matter and you can make really small asks? And then I'm going to do something that no economist knows, including me, which is using large language models and text and AI to try to measure this. So let me start with the part that it's obvious, particularly to the person on my right and to Steve, who had done a lot of this work in the past. So take those equations, do some magic where you make the formulas a little prettier, you make more assumptions. Trade has figured out a wonderful thing to do, which is to use the equilibrium shares and some elasticities to figure out what would be the cost to the target if you actually lose access to these inputs. And it's a great discipline because it tells you that most things don't matter. Anything that you can easily substitute, you can find somebody else to sell it to you. Anything that is not that fundamental in production is going to make sure that the gap between the inside and the outside option is real small. So if you're in policy and you want to say that everything is strategic in the national interest, you're going to struggle with that because most things turn out not to be. And it forces you to recognize under what conditions can you get them to be really important. So I'm going to totally skip this, but you can take it to the data. And I want to highlight a property that actually Ralph has worked heavily on, which is the nonlinearity of the sectors. So when do you have a lot of power over the target? Well, if you want to be very simple about it, it's got two characteristics. The first one is it needs to be an input that you almost overwhelmingly control, where their expenditure share is almost all on you. So here the difference between controlling 99 and 95% of an input is disproportionately big compared to 70 to 50. Okay, that's one part of the nonlinearity. The second one is the elasticity of substitution. As soon as we get close to complements, things blow up. Why? Because if you lose any one of these inputs, you cannot do any production, okay? So the word choke points get thrown around a lot in the press these days. To me, or to an economist, I would argue that a simple definition of a choke point is a sector where I have almost full control of the sector and it's very, very difficult to substitute away. Why? Because it makes my power blow up enormously, okay? And keep that definition because we're going to go back to it. When you measure that in the data, at least the shares are easy to find in the data. Elasticities were bad at. But shares, we can observe in the data. Here, I picked for China and the US, all of the bilateral shares in very disaggregated sectors and then plotted their distribution. You can see that China has a lot of penetration in manufacturing in the sense that very often there are many goods in countries that have 20, 30% of those goods coming from China. But if you think about where the nonlinearity is, that's way, way down. The US, which by the way, here the coalition includes Canada, Europe, Australia. I'm gonna leave it at that. It was written 2 years ago, better, naive times. That's pretty big, but where is it overwhelming? On the green line in financial services. When you look at services, the US not only runs a surplus, but particularly for financial services, if you include Western Europe, they run the overwhelming majority. It's sort of obvious that the vast majority of basic financial services, settlement, payments, custody, are all supplied by the US. So that's where the nonlinearity is going to come in. If you take this to the data, you can start to compute how much of a loss could you inflict on the target countries if you cut them off, if you're the US and China. And you can see some very obvious patterns. East Asia gets a lot of, China gets a lot of power over East Asia. It's overwhelmingly just coming from manufacturing. Singapore is the only place where finance counts, because it's an offshore financial center for China. You look at the US, clearly Mexico and other countries that trade a lot with the US show up, but a very large component of the power comes from the financial sector, which accounts for the fact that the US often indeed uses threats coming from finance because it's a good choke point. It's a sector that has the right characteristics. You might think the semiconductors do too. It's a lot harder to do at this level of aggregation because semiconductors and matter are really farther down the level of aggregation. Okay, I want to leave you with one policy message, then do AI and conclude. So to me, this is something that, again, it took me a while to understand. Maybe it's obvious, but I think it matters for policy. Think of the following thought experiment. China right now accounts for about 3% of world payments. Whichever notion you want to get of the size of their financial services, it's somewhere between 3 or 4%. It's growing fast in percentages. It's coming from zero, but it's pretty small. Suppose that we agree, make it up. 10 years from now, they're going to be 10% of the market. Okay? I'm not saying this is likely or not. Just think of it as a scenario and just think of the consequences. I would argue that the vast majority of sitting US policymakers will say, no problem. The US shares will still be in the high 60s. We're going to be totally dominant. If you think of the macroeconomic consequences, you're probably right. I don't expect that the way monetary policy, exchange rates, lots of the other things will change. If you think about power dynamics, you're totally wrong. It's an absolute disaster for US power for China to be 10% of the payment system. Why? Because a target country the size of Russia or Brazil now has a perfectly viable alternative. So the development of CIPS is much more important if you think about concentration than if you're just thinking about in shares. In shares, the US is going to look enormous for a long time. And just simply saying, well, since we're still going to be above 50% and dominant in shares, there's no problem. It's just not understanding the underlying economics. For the last few minutes, just for fun, we're going to do artificial intelligence, okay? So I know very little about this. My young co-author, Antonio Coppola, on this paper really is the person that you should speak to, but it's fun. So think about the basic problem with threats. Many of you have been in those rooms and might have made those threats. The threats that are most powerful don't get realized, right? Because the target complies. You tell a European bank, stop trading with Iran or we disconnect you, they stop trading with Iran. You tell semiconductors, don't do this and they're going to start adapting. In the previous examples, I use models to create those counterfactuals, but you can also use text. Why? Because the sitting CEO of those firms will have to answer questions on the record of why they're doing something. And they're actually on the record and legally obliged not to avoid not disclosing a material risk. In the old days, that would be hard to do because, well, it's a lot of text and it's quite subtle what they might say about this, but that's really where modern LLMs help. So to cut the story short, you can actually take the leading LLM models, take millions of documents of text, and ask firm by firm, are they saying they're being threatened? What are they being asked to do? How are they reacting? Are they complying? Are they trying to shift their supply chain? Are they increasing or decreasing prices? Yes.
1 minute.
Okay, I will conclude pretty quickly. So go back to the example of ASML. If you run their text through these algorithms, it will tell you that indeed it was the US and Netherlands pressuring them, that the target was China, that the firm products that were being used in the threats were extreme ultraviolet and deep ultraviolet, that the overall impact is negative, and that they complied. They lowered their sales to China instead. I'm going to skip most of this, but you can sort of start from the aggregates. But what I want to show you is the disaggregated data. When you look at the data, the US mostly uses semiconductors to target China, that's obvious. China mostly uses minerals to target the US in retaliation, but you can go much deeper. And since we are almost out of time, I want to show you that you can take the previous formula, you can take the heart rate data, and you can say, did the US pick sector at random, or did he use those firms that are in sectors with low elasticities and very high concentration of trade shares? And so the bolds here are nothing else than the AI frequency with which you use these firms. And if this was random, the red parts would have been all over the place. Instead, you can see that the US is correctly picking up the sector. So our colleagues here that have been doing this didn't pick at random. They picked things that an economist would have recognized as having a chance of affecting the target. Just because we're out of time, I'm going to do this, because today is too good not to do it. It's the tariffs. So these are the reaction of US firms to US tariffs. They overwhelmingly report them to be negative. You see that little blue line that says that the tariffs are positive? If you go and inspect who they are, here's the story. The light blue is the firms that report that the tariffs are good for them. Okay? The dark blue are the US firms that report that the tariffs are bad for them. Look at the prices. The firms that report that they're bad for them report facing very high input prices. They do report raising their own prices. The firms that report that they're good for them are much less likely to say that they face higher input prices, but just as likely to say that they're raising their prices. What's the story is the domestic producer subsidy. This is a firm that says, I don't import from Mexico. I'm a steel plant. I don't import from Mexico. My competitor does. My competitor is affected. They're raising prices. I get to raise my prices in response without facing higher input costs, so that's good for me. Those are also the only firms in the middle, if you see them, that report ever increase in domestic investment as a response to the tariff. And unfortunately, they're the vast minority of the data. So you can do lots of these sort of little fun things with AI. Let me conclude by just saying, look, I just cannot think of a more pressing challenge that we should collectively study across fields. There's a ton more to do about this, thinking about multiple hegemons, the political economy, the duality with the military. This is just the economic part. And the data, it's becoming more and more available. The data is bad, okay? Trade data is hard. The WTO did more data on services, but it's still very hard to get good data on services. AI is imperfect, but it's an order of magnitude better than flying blind and saying some sector is strategic. And so I'm hopeful that this helps pushing the debate forward, but also constraining it and making some sense of what we're uncertain about and the things that are easily wrong on the edges. That's it.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. I'm going to start off here. We're going to have a discussion now. We've got 30 minutes. I have one point and then a question for you. I think your point about China, how China's geoeconomic power and alleviating the ability of the U.S. to exercise choke points doesn't require that much in the way of its participation in the payment system or the financial system. I think that's a key point. It's worth thinking about that. It also applies to the U.S. manufacturing sector and undermining it, dealing with its vulnerability to China's manufacturing dominance does not require that we reproduce the Chinese manufacturing base. It only requires that we mitigate the force of certain choke points, and that can be done much more cheaply. So I think that's a central point. Then I wanted to ask you a question. When I think about why the international economic and security system is under so much strain, I see three possibilities, two of which come out of your model, and the third which is outside the scope of your model. One is, and I'm thinking of the U.S. as being the hegemon for recent decades, the U.S. lost control of these international organizations, so can no longer use them as a tool to sustain a less coercive equilibrium that it likes. That's one possibility. The second is the underlying economic structures have evolved in a way that just make it look much less attractive to the United States to try to play the role of the hegemon that it had played in the past. Obviously, China's rise is relevant in that respect, but so could other factors that are more subtle that are maybe captured by your analysis. The third possibility that's outside the scope of your model is that internal political and economic interests in the United States, which again has been the hegemon for the last 80 years or so, are misaligned with the U.S. national interest as a hegemon, but have come to the fore politically in a way that have come to drive U.S. decisions about its engagement with the rest of the world. And I'd just like to know whether you have any views based on the analysis you just summarized, or otherwise, that incline you towards one or the other of those three possibilities, or do you think I've got something wrong in the list of possibilities?
Perfect. So these are great questions. So first, let me double down on the first part that you mentioned. So this kind of analysis offers a silver lining in terms of economic security, because it does tell you that dependency is really about those extreme sectors. So moving a little bit away generates a lot of security with very little fragmentation. So in that sense, analysis is quite different from Hirschman. Hirschman had the sort of view that full diversification, so all equal shares, would have been no dependency. But really, because here you have to aggregate them with 70 years of insights of trade and macro, and you're thinking about which of the few nonlinearities survive the full aggregation, all you have to do is move away from those. So a few targeted interventions that in the trade data are not going to look like a lot of fragmentation, generate a lot of resilience. And so you don't have to decouple the US and China in all sectors in order to be resilient if you're the US or Europe. And that's an important message, because right now there is a bit of a sentence of, I look at the shares, anything where China has a high share, we're too dependent. Well, but if it's in things that I can easily substitute ex post, why not? It's just, there's no dependency. So I think that message is very important. I hope it comes across in the more general public. To the second part, let me start with what is definitely not in the model, and I think it's important, which is the political economy component, the domestic political economy. In particular, there's a very clear conflict between the sectors being used for these policies and the government. I think of NVIDIA. So what does NVIDIA actually want to do? It would like to sell to everybody, restrict the supply so that it generates high markups. It wants to be a monopolist. What does the US want to do with NVIDIA? It wants it to sell to everybody but China at much lower prices, so flood the market, make it very difficult to build an alternative, and exclude China. So you can see that the way the US wants to use the firm and the way the firm wants to maximize its profits are not aligned. That's going to generate a ton of political lobbying. The fact that, if you look at that 3D graph, the fact that we're using very few sectors for this also means those sectors are going to have a lot of interest in lobbying, and the rest of the economy is quite different. We haven't studied any of that, and I think it's quite first order. To the first part, that instead, the other points that you mentioned on the model, here's my crude thinking about this. And this is far away from what I can prove or what I would stand by in the confines of a model. But I think we might have made a bit of a mistake in communicating the value of international organizations to the general public. I mentioned that I would have communicated as the incarnation of some global planner. But if you think about the colloquial version of that statement, it sounds a lot like it's good for them. And if you keep saying it's good for the foreigners, at some point somebody's going to get the idea that this must only be good for the foreigners. Imagine that instead we have communicated these are restraints that we put on ourselves that are good for us. They make sure that people want to deal with us despite the fact that we're big and powerful. That would have been a different narrative. And it might have helped with a narrative of this is something that we do for ourselves. And in the 40s, that was pretty obvious. I mean, the fact that the IMF and the World Bank are 2 blocks from the White House isn't a random choice. They're an incarnation of a particular moment. But that narrative got lost, and particularly with the WTO, it totally got lost. It's always phrased as it's good for them. And that's why I almost skewed the model extremely to say, suppose that all you do is you constrain yourself. You don't constrain the foreigners at all. Even that is good for you. And I think that message, I'm hopeful, it helps explain the values of these commitments, and that just going to brute coercion, it's a short-term strategy. It lasts until everybody else walks away from the table.
All right, thank you. We've already got 9 people on the list here, so let's try to be brief.
I'll keep the answers brief, I'm sorry.
And I'll start with Stephen Redding to my left.
Thanks. Terrific presentation about this fundamental set of issues. I wanted to touch on something you said at the end there, which is sort of the one thing that's really different between international trade and, say, military conflict, is that international trade is actually win-win, as you highlighted during the talk. So we all actually mutually benefit from trading with one another, specialize in what we're good at, sell it on world markets, and get other goods in return. And one way of connecting with power in the discussion could be, and I mean, your notion is broader than this, but could be an attempt to influence the terms of trade. So an attempt to influence the share of those aggregate gains. But of course, in doing so, as you sort of highlighted, one of the dangers is that by trying to get a bigger share of the pie, we actually make the overall pie smaller because countries can't achieve those gains from trade. And that's exactly your sort of hegemonic view of international organizations. I wonder if you had any kind of thoughts now, we're in a world where the US is a smaller share of world GDP. Is there any scope for sort of trying to preserve rules-based international organizations as a way of all getting those mutual gains from trade and sort of limiting ourselves? Is there a way to achieve that in a world where there isn't the one big hegemon, or are we really sort of destined to fall back to a sort of power-based international order where we kind of lose those rule-based ideas?
I mean, you know more than I do about this, but my thoughts are, first of all, manipulating the terms of trade or manipulating technology externalities here, roughly speaking, is the same thing. That's why I phrase them as aggregates. Now, manipulating the terms of trade, as we've seen yesterday, it's something that it's not obvious that we can do in the data. I mean, we put a lot of tariffs and the foreigners aren't cutting prices. I find that surprising, but it tells me that maybe that's not a huge force. We'll see, but certainly technology and strategic complementarities, we see them all the time in semiconductors, in payment systems. The model, and I think the logic is, yes, everything can be mutually beneficial, but because I'm skewing the entire equilibrium, you might be participating even if you're actually worse off overall. You just don't perceive it because you take the world as given. For small countries, that's definitely true. I don't think that works so well when you're dealing with China. I mean, those are two big countries bargaining. One of the things that I'm interested in now, I don't have the answers, is thinking of, if you're in a world with multiple hegemons, does that make the world better or worse? And here's my intuitive answers right now. Normally, we would say two of them is good because they're going to compete with each other and they're going to offer a better world to everybody else. But actually, that might be very bad. And think about why. So suppose that the US had commitments and was willing to keep them because there's a lot of value from running the world. And now I tell them, China's coming, you're going to have to share the value. 50% of everything that you've had in rents in the past is going to go to China. You might turn very extractive while you have the rest of the world. It might make you very nasty in the short run because you want to squeeze everything while you have it, knowing in the future you have to share. So it's not so obvious that going to multiple hegemons is better for the world. Sometimes one big person gives you commitment.
Right. Okay, thank you. And Emily Blanchard.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation, as always. I want to sort of play with two ideas around the game itself as you've articulated it, and I think it comes right back to the point where you just left off, which is thinking about the world with multiple hegemons. This is fundamentally an asymmetric game. I think I've made this comment before around this paper, so I apologize, but I think it is really important just to recognize there is an offense and there is a defense in the game, and then you very clearly and cleverly talk about what equilibrium looks like and turn towards measurement. In practice, though, there are multiple antagonists, and both sides can use offensive tools. So in this point, one option is to defend by trying to preempt the threat of the hegemon exercising power against you. The other is to come up with your own threat point set of tools. And I think that that is actually the game that we're living in now, as opposed to an asymmetric offense and defense. So number one, this is a really cool clarification of a game. I'm not sure it is the game. And the other thing that I'll say that's related to this, even in an asymmetric game structure, there is a pre-game. So you've got an offense, the hegemon's going to threaten to take away my toys or my access to Swift or whatever it is. And therefore, I will protect myself by engaging in anti-coercion, sort of a prevention strategy to try to neutralize that threat. But of course, the pre-game is the hegemon anticipates this and puts new threats on the table. Well, if the threat of de-swifting you isn't enough, what if we threaten something even worse? What if we threaten to blow up the entire rules-based order? What if we threaten to stop trading completely across the board? What if we threaten, heaven forbid, military action? And I worry that we may be living in an environment where that pre-game is shifting. All of your calibrated counterfactual, again, super cool, but they are predicated on a threat point that is not moving, and I fear that that threat point is moving as the antagonists shift how they're thinking about the world. Thanks.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I hope at some point to have better answers for that. We're working on it. But just for simplicity, let me pick the case of Singapore. I'm just going to simply rephrase what you just asked me. So think of Singapore and think of the strategic value of Singapore in a game where you have multiple hegemons. Okay? So for the US, controlling Singapore has all on the offense. If you're already controlling 90% of the world financial system, it is of extreme value to you to control the other few financial centers because then you get into the real choke point. That also means that for China, the inverse is true. Controlling Singapore is entirely on the defense side. It prevents the offense of the US and therefore is valuable to you. But power isn't additive. China controlling Singapore doesn't increase the financial power of China at all. There's still going to be a little speck in the world financial system, but it's a huge strategic interest on the defense side. And semiconductors is going to play exactly the same way. And so what the models that we're working on are models where you have to think about both sides, and strategic then becomes strategic on both defense and offense, which is exactly what you have in mind. Now, that logic is crude. It can stick. What I don't know is how much else is there when you do this right. We'll see down the line.
Okay, we're not going to get to everybody, but we'll do as well as we can. Ralph Osa, you're next on the list.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be quick. So it was a great presentation. I already learned a lot. One thing that you said, and that one also often hears in the policy discussion, is that there's a trade-off between the economic gains from trade and security, or economic security, because you don't want to be dependent on other countries. So I always ask myself, what happened to this old idea of interdependence? So one way to make myself less subjective to economic coercion is, of course, to become independent. But the alternative would be to actually make you also dependent on me in some other sector. And from a trade perspective, at least, it seems like the smarter strategy, because if you want to be independent, you invest in your weaknesses. But if I want to make you dependent, I can invest in my strength and actually play up my comparative advantage, so to speak.
So that is totally right, and it does goes on even in this class of models. What I would say in practice is that it's a very hard balance, particularly when technology is shifting. Ultimately, I'm sympathetic to the policymakers saying, look, rather than trying to figure out that we both have huge dependencies, if we exactly cancel, what if I'm wrong, I get a big imbalance, I just want to scale it down. And so I think because it's not precisely because the relationship isn't symmetric. If I'm selling you semiconductors and you're selling me basic manufacturing, in trade shares, it might look like we're interdependent, but in power, we're not at all. And I think it's just a very difficult balance. It's like, the old Kissinger, balance of power in Europe. It's just a difficult game to play. And as soon as it becomes unbalanced, you get major conflicts because we're now playing with a lot of interdependence. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to the view of, look, I just want to de-risk it in levels and not just balance it. But, the force is definitely there.
All right, thank you. Next on the list is Daryl Duffy.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on Ralph's point. I'm a Canadian. I'm interested not in the perspective of a hegemon, but rather of what Mark Carney called a middle-sized country or a middle power. So in this trade-off between security and economic consumer surplus, Carney has chosen to protect Canada's security, and he's cut himself off from the chance of getting the benefits that the United States is offering if Canada were only willing to succumb to the U.S. Canada has established new trade relationships with China. It's looking around the world to try to set up alternatives, and it has, in a very non-economic way, decided to do its own military procurement rather than to rely on the U.S. So obviously, Carney is putting up a flag saying to all other middle-powered countries, join with us, and collectively, perhaps we can isolate the United States to an extent that it's not in their interest to pursue this. Where can we see this in the lens of your model? This is not fragmentation in the way that you described it in your model, where Canada just unplugs.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, some people have joked recently that this should be called a model of the Carney speech. It was written long before, but yes, it has elements of that. So think of the targets. The targets here are middle powers. They're powerful enough that they are doing their own economy. They understand that their impact some of the technology, but they're not going to play the big hegemons game just by construction. Okay, but if you want to see in the model what you just said is think about the defensive policy and the role for coordination. If I do it alone, all I'm going to do is take the world as given and try to fight the hegemon by shaping my own economy. But what is my first alternative is to tell some other country to be in a coalition with me that prevents the hegemon using them from cutting me off. That's very valuable. That's the European area. If you're Italy, your first point of call if you get cut off from something is France and Germany. And as long as they're offering diversification to you, that's quite valuable. And so the idea, what we're seeing right now is the world making bilateral trade deals away from the US. And I think of it as you're constantly trying to look for a safe alternative that you're going to have if you get cut off. So it's a very natural response in this model. Deeper down in the theory, which it's obvious to you, is it also helps you coordinate policy. You don't want Canada to say, we need a steel mill, and so does France, and so does Germany. We can agree that one in the three countries is enough as long as we're promising that we're not going to cut each other off. And so you can allow for a lot of that benefit by coordinating policy. And what seems to be happening is a lot of these deals are occurring. Europe just did one with India, and in some sense is fragmenting the older multilateral deals and is going to bespoke deals in some industries and some countries, but the incentive comes clearly from that.
Great. Jim Farron.
Thanks. Also, really interesting stuff. I have a question about the, geoeconomic models more generally, which is how do you think about what is the hegemon's objective function? So traditionally, in a lot of international economics models, it would be something like maximize GDP per capita. And I can see elements of that here, but like when you are trying to incorporate something like a trade-off with security, whatever that is, how are you thinking about that?
Yes, the short answer is badly, and I would like to speak more with you about it. So let me show it to you in an equation so that it's clearer to everybody. So look at the objective function that I set up. The first part is standard
so
economics.
It's like consumption and other stuff.
Consumption and other stuff. So I sort of restrain myself to say, suppose that you want to a basic economic model where all I care about is consumer surplus, standard objective, here's what happens. I then added a plug that says, suppose that you care about other things. One of those elements might be the size of the military sector in a foreign country. But you can see that the model is going to be totally silly in putting it into an objective by construction. It's going to have deep answers saying, given that objective, how does the game play out? I think your work and those of others in the defense space has been providing foundations for why you might have that term in the utility function. And those foundations are not irrelevant to how the game plays. So for now, it's a pure plug, but I put it there for that reason. That's all we did.
Okay, thank you. Maury Obsfeld.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief on this stuff. I think this point about the rules constraining the hegemon in order to get smaller countries to participate in the system is important. I think it's something economists have talked about somewhat in the literature, not just political scientists, although political scientists have also. Mark Mazauer had a piece in the FT on the United Nations, and at the end of it he refers to what he calls flexible and fruitful hypocrisy, which I took to be basically this mechanism at work. You're a hegemon, you're powerful, you run the system, but there's some rules that you mostly obey, and that's enough to get smaller countries to participate. And I think that's an example of a bigger feature that's important, which is the provision of public goods. The rules are a major public good. The US has provided other public goods. And that's clearly eroding, but I think it's partly eroding for dynamic factors that aren't in your model. As the US becomes a smaller part of the world economy, as multilateralism and globalization actually succeed by creating structural transformation, which is disruptive within the US, you get domestic and international political forces that make it much harder to sustain public good provision to the economy as a whole. And so what we see the US doing is saying, well, maybe we'll supply public goods to the Western Hemisphere in return for resources and power. And these are things that are, would be great to model. I don't think they're all in your story, but they're there in the news.
So, I mean, on the first part, absolutely, don't get me wrong. I mean, particularly in trade, I mean, Kyle is here and Ralph is here. There's a lot of literature on, for example, the WTO having exactly that feature, trying to, put in the rules so that you're not afraid that I'm going to manipulate the terms of trade and you come in. We're picking back on that one. And the general sort of theory of commitment being good in macro. But I do think that a lot of the international macro literature focuses on planning problems and implementing the planning problem in some conditions and not starting with, I'm just doing this as a naked objective of, it's good for me. And I think the emphasis is still important. These are all sort of, interior solutions in some sense. To the last part, there's a lot of subtlety there, but providing the public goods, like the Kindleberger view of a hegemon, it's embedded in these models. Why? Because, well, look, all else equal, if I could just simply shift the inside option out, that's still power. If I can provide safety at sea, enforcement contracts, we can build mines in Asia or in Africa because I'm a good enforcer, that does increase my power. And that's a positive element of the game. I want to provide those goods because they increase my power. The problem is that I also have the incentive to move the outside option down. I could also just be extractive and make your life miserable. So both things are there, and I play both contemporaneously. I think I like that in the model because it tells you that the hegemon here isn't just a force for bad. It could be a force for good. There are many equilibria in this framework where the world is better off having a hegemon. It coordinates the externalities, it pushes the inside option up, it extracts some rents. What's bad with it? Everybody else is left better off. That's a traditional view of the provision of public goods, but you have to remember that there is also the other aspect. I only care about the gap. I can increase the gap by pushing the inside option up or the outside option down. Both things are there, and I think it's important to recognize that they're both there. And then, of course, there's a ton these are caricature of the world, so there's plenty that is not captured or captured badly.
Okay, thank you. Chris Meissner.
My question was kind of along the lines of James' question, like, what's the measure of effectiveness and how does a policymaker know, whether the costs offset the benefits here, what's the measure of success? Like, if you want to take this to a decision room and say, well, that one was effective, this one wasn't. Maybe I missed it, but maybe you can explain it further.
No, you didn't. So let me mention things that these are good at and bad at, and I think it's not just these models, it's common to a lot of our work in economics. So I think what this one does, empirically, it rules out some of the edges. We're much better at saying things that are obviously wrong versus the big middle ground that reasonable people are going to disagree. For example, this tells you, if you want to tell me that these threats are so powerful, show me the data. Tell me that you can tell me that this sector has high concentrations, lowest elasticity of substitution, it's so hard to find an alternative. Look at their domestic sectors. Most things don't pass the smell test. Most things that are routinely in the news as if they generate these super powerful threats, even a cursory look at the data will say, maybe not. For example, I went through the mental exercise of looking at the semiconductor supply chain and thinking about how many things do you have to believe for the export controls on semiconductors to actually bite. It's an ugly list. I mean, first you need to be very sure that the difference between super advanced semiconductors and just slightly worse, it's enormous for the development of LLMs. I'm not even sure that the people that develop the LLMs are so convinced on what the technology of the future is. Then you have to recognize that there is Korea that has fabs in China. You have to recognize that Vietnam might be able to scale up. You have to recognize that China is investing in R&D, and why couldn't they produce it domestically? By the time you're done with all that, not so obvious. Finance, I think, to me, was the only one where I would say, okay, I have to believe very few things. I do think that if you're not on SWIFT, the alternatives are poor substitutes, and I do believe it's highly concentrated. That doesn't tell you that in the middle, for all the things that are reasonable, these models are that prescriptive or that they're ability to be tested and make empirical predictions is that high. I would share the blame with 3/4 of macro theory and public finance. Yeah, we're there. I think those TAUs are easy to theorize and hard to measure.
Okay, maybe 95%, not 3/4. But last short question, comment, Peter Henry.
Thank you, Steve. So I just want to connect Jim Ferrand's point about the importance of thinking about the objective function with Steve's, I think, third point, which was the political economy. And can we distinguish between the various potential explanations? There are many insights in your model. One thing, of the most important insights is this one about we can get a lot more resilience for a little bit of more coercion. And if you take that point seriously and you could have looked sort of qualitatively at the time series of U.S. post-1945, that strongly suggests something radical happened in the political economy in the last 2 years, right? Because if you think about it, just the point of free trade is it's good for us. And I think that story has been told incrementally over the years, and that explains why we've done sort of things around the margins, right? Because if you just think about U.S. productivity relative to Europe and Japan since 1984, massive increases. And that which again increases our relative power relative to those hegemons. China, different story. But again, in your world, I think we can tell a story where for incremental changes, not slapping on tariffs, we get a lot more leverage against China. So, food for thought.
You want to say last words on that one?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is people often ask me two things. First is, does this explain Trump? No, God no. But the second one is, why now? And I think my answer to why now are really three things. First is, we are in a world where the technological innovations has made sectors with very large strategic complementarities more and more important. Mm-hmm. Think about services, digital services, finance payments. Even the fact that transport costs have gone down tells you the ability to play this game has gone up. Yeah. The second thing is, I do think is a major lacking change in commitment. And that has to do with the domestic political economy that I have modeled very little. But people point to the second very often, I think it's correct, but they forget the first. We're much more now as a global economy in a world of natural monopolies, yes, where one big player is going to provide a lot of the services. Yeah. And that's a world where this plays a much bigger role. And I think that that's going to keep happening with AI, with everything being digitized. Think of AI. A few firms might supply in the future the vast majority of AI services online. Who controls that one has a lot of power. Yeah. And in the 1920s, there were very few things of that kind. So I think that these issues are going to become more and more important.
All right. Thank you very much, Matteo, for a stimulating presentation, and thanks to all the commenters. This was a great start to the conference. We will break now and resume promptly at 11.